This is Inside Geneva. I'm your host, Imogen Folks, and this is a production from Swissinfo, the international public media company of Switzerland. In today's programme.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled.
When I was in the US, I definitely see there's no interest for anything called multilateralism or collaboration globally.
There are some in my country who would force Ukraine to give up large parts of its sovereign territory.
There are two words that are key here. One is the notion of polarization. Not only in the United States, but internationally. We see it in Geneva, we see it everywhere. And the second is the word transactional. Everything seems to be transactional. What's in this for me?
I gave them Golan Heights, I gave them the Abraham Accords, I recognized the capital of Israel and opened the embassy in Jerusalem, gave them billions and billions of dollars. I was the best friend Israel ever had.
Is multilateralism a system that allows all countries to deal with each other in a civil and non-violent way where common interest prevails? Or is it the appearance of a system that allows the continued hegemony of the old powers after World War II?
International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. The scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating.
I would say that this particular conflict has done more to undermine the US place in the world, but at the same time undermine the multilateral system than anything that we've seen in the last few decades.
It's a matter of support, political, financial, moral support to international questions, to international Geneva. I think Europe is there, yes, but Europe will not be able, I think, to match the United States.
I don't think we can afford to sit in an arena where our hope for multilateralism, which still is the United Nations and its institutions, is still sitting, taking the constant bullying of the United States.
Hello and welcome again to Inside Geneva. I'm Imogen Folks, and today we're going to talk US presidential elections. It may be a bit of a cliche to say that Europe is looking anxiously across the Atlantic, worrying maybe about another Trump win. But here in Geneva, we want to go a little deeper than that. So regardless of who wins, how important is the United States these days? How committed is it, Democrat or Republican, to the things we talk so much about here in Geneva, international law, standards, the fundamental principles we all apparently agreed on post-World War II, what we often call the rules-based order. To join me, I've got regular analyst Daniel Warner, Swedish journalist Gunilla von Hall, and head of the humanitarian agency MSF Netherlands, Tammam Aloudat. He is originally from Syria. Welcome to you all. Danny, as the US citizen in the room, I'm going to come to you first. Talking to you a while ago, you said neither Trump nor Harris was going to campaign on foreign policy. It's just not a factor to American voters, you think?
No, as someone famously said, it's the economy, stupid. Foreign affairs is not a major issue, but it should be said, Imogen, to start with, why is the United States election that important? And it should be reiterated that the United States was fundamental to the League of Nations and fundamental to starting the UN. So it's normal that everyone's looking at the election. Whether the results will affect multilateralism, whether the results will help the UN, that remains to be seen.
Gunilla, let me come to you next, because you've actually been in the States reporting on the elections. I'm just wondering what your sense of it is.
It's very interesting because I was there this summer to report on the election. I was at a Trump rally in Minnesota. I was at a Kamala Harris rally in Atlanta. I was in Washington, in the suburbs and in the city. And almost everyone I spoke to were basically focused on kitchen table issues. They want to have lower prices for food, grocery prices, lower gasoline prices, and close the border. Basically, these three issues. And then when I try to speak about, well, what about international, what about Ukraine and Gaza or Taiwan, it was barely that people reacted. And they would say, like, well, Ukraine, especially with Ukraine, people told me, both the Trump crowd and also people at the Kamala Harris rally, that why do we continue to support and pay money and give weapons? We should care about the United States, about our country first, and then care about Ukraine and far away. And where is Ukraine anyway? It was striking how little appetite and interest there were in international affairs, international policy, and what the United States can do.
You know, it's quite interesting you say that. I heard a European former ambassador to Washington commenting on this. He said it's probably not really a question of whether the US will withdraw from international affairs. It's basically one candidate will slam the door on his way out and the other will creep away, hoping nobody notices. I hope it's not as bad as that. But Tammam, let me ask you, because we're in a very unstable world. And I heard your colleague from Doctors Without Borders, Médecins, Frontières, I read in an article today talking about how the big powers, in particular the United States, was using humanitarian aid as a kind of smokescreen, and that their actual foreign policy is at best helpless and at worst part of the problem, particularly when it comes to the Middle East.
Yes, I do think it is worth examining now, particularly at this moment, whether we're looking at a system that has broken down or a system that we have convinced ourselves existed when it really didn't. If you think about, we're talking about multilateralism, and here it warrants a definition. Is multilateralism a system that allows all countries to deal with each other in a civil a non-violent way where common interest prevails? Or is it the appearance of a system that allows the continued hegemony of the old powers after World War II? I mean, the first thing you said, a system we designed after World War II, who the we is. Most of us were under colonial rule at the time. We designed nothing. And we still suffer the consequences of a system that is designed to empower people already in power. I'm not going to venture to think why is one going to slam the door and the other going to creep out. It's beside the point now. Maybe it doesn't pay to be in the pretense of multilateral system anymore. But at least let's make a possible starting point. The fact that there hasn't been an equitable multilateral rules-based order ever. It's not a Trump thing. The humanitarian crisis only mattered as far as they mattered in ex-colonies or in places of interest. So what we probably are seeing now is, rather than a new smoke screen, the clearing of the old smoke screens. And I here won't talk about the US alone, but it seems to me that Western governments stopped caring about appearing benevolent as cheaply as that comes through the crumbs of humanitarian aid they give. The UK under Johnson stopped funding others. So it's about what do they care about now, and what do they care to pretend to be at this point?
That is a really important question. I saw you nodding there, Gunilla, and I want to come to you on that point. But Danny, I'd maybe ask you first. I mean, Tammam is way beyond our framing of the debate in the sense that he doesn't see the US as a global leader at all in any kind of beneficial way, whoever is in the White House.
Well, I think he makes an interesting distinction between who the we are. I did mention, Tom, on the United States. I didn't say it was beyond that. But the question of whether the UN and multilateralism are Western oriented or universal is a very good point. I would make a distinction, though. The UN is totally failing in making sure there's peace and security. There's no issue about that in Ukraine, Middle East, and other places, Sudan. But there are certain organizations in Geneva, the ITU, International Telecommunications, or others, that may have certain benefits for countries all over the world. So I would say that what we're seeing now is the inability of the UN to deal with peace and security, which is supposed to be one of its, if not its, fundamental thing to do.
Gunilla, what do you make of Tammam's point that maybe this multilateral system never properly existed, or perhaps only in the minds of the Western powers?
I tend to agree, and more, and that's based on what I hear working as a journalist in different areas. Now, when I was in the US, I definitely see there's no interest for anything called multilateralism or collaboration globally. Perhaps with some questions like climate change and diseases and so forth, but politically there is almost like a resignation because Security Council is always blocked. Nothing happens. They are incapable of stopping any large conflicts, like Danny is saying also. So I see that, and also what I tend to see, I was in Russia in this year, and of course you get another point of view from there, but there I also hear this, that we do not want to have this, we want to have a multipolar world. It is BRICS, it is India, China, South Africa, other countries than Europe and the US. I don't only hear this from the Russians, but also from other quarters. An interest in kind of turning away from the multilateralism that has been invented or built up like a structure by the Western world and by the United States. So yes, there is our notion of multilateralism from perhaps a Western point of view that is in crisis.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned BRICS because they are meeting, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in Russia, the no-go area for the West, the sanction after sanction after sanction, and yet these big emerging economic powers are meeting there. They're going to do some very good deals together, I expect. And I wonder, and again, I will ask you this, Tammam, we've had for a long time in Geneva the claim of double standards towards the traditional Western powers, but that in the last 12 months, over the conflict in Gaza, I'm wondering whether the Western powers have lost any of the moral authority they had. And I obviously, because we're talking about the elections in the United States, I include the United States in that.
Yeah, I just want to follow a bit on what Danny said on some of the UN functions. I think, to be fair, even organizations that haven't had the best reputation for being effective or outspoken, like WHO, have spoken better than many others in the past. Between COVID and Gaza, we've heard from WHO positions that are not what you'd expect here from WHO, courageous and straightforward. But to go back to moral authority, as someone who comes from a country that has been historically opposed to American imperialism, I don't know that everybody else thinks of the moral authority in the West as fondly as the West thinks of it. This is why I talk about the stopping the pretense rather than stopping the action. Much of the world has suffered the double edge of the West wanting to appear moral while acting immoral over the past many decades. And now we don't at least have to pretend that the West is moral anymore. In the sense of, if you look at Palestine and the complete negligence of what's happening, continuing supplying weapons. I mean, Macron wants to appear like a champion now that a year later and 42,000 people dead, he's calling for stopping exporting weapons to Israel. And Biden speaks very mildly about the situation with Netanyahu. And John Bolton goes on CNN and tells him to put a sock in it. I mean, there's not even a semi-civilized conversation anymore. And it's the reason I mentioned that, not because, I want to amplify the obscenity of Bolton, but because it seems to pay better for home politics to be openly rude and foul-mouthed about being a civilized nation among nations.
Now that is a very depressing, but actually I think quite accurate point. Danny, you've got your hand up. Do come in.
Yeah, but Taman, I want to make a distinction here. If the United States or the West no longer has the moral compass, what about the UN or certain people in international organizations? I think always of Cornelio Sommaruga. To me, when he was president of the Red Cross, there was a moral compass there. Do we have any leaders in the UN or other places who are moral leaders today? I think the whole concept of moral authority is declining, if not disappearing.
Yeah, I think there is a point that there's so much contradictions and double standards, because you can see the US always says we're the global champion of democracy and human rights, but at the same time it has alliances with these authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, and that really have criticism for the human rights violations. And this, I think, undermines the US credibility in these questions. And this is a big issue. A lot of people say, the US, we're going to lead, they're the leader of democracy, of human rights, but then in practice, what are they doing? There was a military intervention in Iraq, in Libya, but the Syrian civil war, nothing really changed with the US. We have the Uyghurs in China. There hasn't been much action either if you compare to what happened in Iraq and Libya. So the choices are driven by geopolitical interest rather than these moral principles and weight that we could expect perhaps from the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you are echoing things I hear in Geneva, not just from non-Western countries, but increasingly from some Western countries, that, you have this cliched status as the leader of the free world. I mean, even that phrase starts to bug me. But let's bring it down to something which is also important, and that is cash, dollars, because the United States is a big funder of the UN humanitarian agencies in Geneva, big funder to the World Health Organization, to the UN Refugee Agency, also to the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, under Trump Mark I, we saw him start moving away from the US left the Human Rights Council, left the Paris Climate Accord, left the Iran nuclear deal, wanted to leave the World Health Organization. So that matters, doesn't it? I mean, the money, were it Trump or even political pressure on a Democrat president to cut things back, that's going to matter here in Geneva.
Yeah, but the question is, Imogen, supposing Trump gets elected and supposing he does what he promises by stopping funding or reducing, is it worth it for other countries to step forward? And that's, to me, the fundamental question. If Taman is talking about the lack of Western credibility in the UN system, is it worth it for some other countries to step forward and say, if the US isn't paying, we'll take up that deficit? And that, to me, is a real question. Because if they want the UN to be less Western oriented, okay, you be more active, or maybe you begin to take charge. That might be an interesting possibility.
We certainly see very little cash coming from China, for example, or the Gulf states who have plenty of it.
Yeah, and that's been a long time that they've been asking for, as we see in the UN, asking for more support, especially from the Gulf states and China. We've been seeing that in how many humanitarian crises lately, I don't know, but there's nothing coming from there. So that is true. It's the US, it is Europe to a large extent.
Tammam, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, if we take a slightly cynical view, I understand asking other countries to take charge. But if we measure it by money, then we are saying that poor countries will never take charge of anything. And I think they can, and they should. And COVID has given us an example where several countries refused the framework that has failed in distributing vaccines and negotiated on their own, and actually got vaccinated before other Western countries. So the point is, if we are talking about a failing multilateralism, and I'm not saying this is the case, but this is part of the argument, then why do you expect other actors to come and invest in a failing and rigged game that they haven't designed and cannot control against a superpower that economically and militarily? I've traveled across much of Africa in the past 20 years, and China is giving a lot of money, not to the UN, but to infrastructure. The US invests very little in infrastructure so we still are seeing the game from the existing Western multilateral eye. Others are coming with other means and methods. Now, one of the issues is if other countries want to invest, then there needs to be a possibility of reform of the multilateral system. And here I'm making the distinction, Danny, that you mentioned between the peace and security part, which is completely blocked, as Gunilla mentioned. It's like Security Council is dysfunctional, and the investing in actually livability, which other agencies provide. I think it is absolutely worth reforming and improving the functioning of agencies that improve livability without having to stick to the current shape. But I don't know how would we ever be able to overcome the complete blockage of the peace and security part.
I think it's, yeah, we're coming back to the issue too, what Danny was speaking about, the Security Council and when and how it can be reformed and be more representative of today's world. Because if you have that, then countries will feel also that they're participating more, they have more influence, and then maybe they want to also contribute more. But as you have a Security Council that's stuck with these five, you're also going to have perhaps the whole structure of how much countries want to help is going to be blocked.
Yeah, you know, we're in Geneva, and Geneva is the site where the League of Nations folded. And is there a possibility that either the United Nations folds and the multilateral system goes under, or it continues in one way or another, but it's totally ineffectual? And that's when I think Tammam picked it up. The question of the fights that are going on, the violence that's going on, and the fact that the UN has nothing to do with make any kind of peaceful settlement or humanitarian is terribly disappointing, and I would think enormously worrying for Geneva.
That's where my next question was going as well, actually, because we've got two viewpoints being expressed here, but on the same lines. One is that the Security Council, the current setup of the United Nations, is so mired in the past and so blocked that it's becoming discredited. Tammam, you said, well, some countries might want to just do things their own way, i.e., not through the multilateral system. But where does that leave the United Nations? And particularly, where does it leave humanitarian aid? Because certainly there can be bilateral efforts, but there are some crises which I would say still need a multilateral effort. Perhaps not one that's as discredited as we have now, but that need one. I mean, Gaza would be one, actually, if it worked.
So I would say if I follow on a mention of where's the leadership that Danny mentioned, moral leadership. I believe, at least from appearance and so on, Guterres might be a moral person, but leadership, it's either impossible or beyond his capacity at this point to assert. And you said, who do I remember? I mean, I remember reading about Dag Hammarskjöld and his diplomacy. I remember reading about people who actually went, I can't remember who is it, that did land in Baghdad and negotiate with Saddam on the airport. That doesn't seem to be there anymore. It seems to be more of a massive three-dimensional chess game where people don't seem to be taking enough risk. And Imogen, I definitely don't think it is beyond multilateralism and that we don't need it anymore. But I don't think we can afford to sit in a arena where our hope for multilateralism, which still is the United Nations and its institutions, is still sitting, taking the constant bullying of the United States and unable to answer, have no capacity to answer. And here, I'll just give you an example. In New York, in the UN General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago, on a session on Sudan, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield sat on a panel and talked about how she has, her heart is broken about how Sudan shows the collapse of compassion, I think she said it. And this is the same person who has vetoed every resolution on ceasefire and gas. Like, okay, you are a superpower, fine. Do you need to insult us, insult our, short-term memory to this extent? Do we need to act like this? I don't know, to be honest, that if this is the moderate, supposedly leftist government in the US, I mean, who needs enemies when you have friends like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've highlighted very starkly there with that example the dismay and anger that we hear all the time in Geneva, particularly at Human Rights Council, about double standards. There are more and more countries. I mean, Gunilla, you're nodding there. I mean, there are some in Western Europe as well, but they're not very loud.
No, it's true. No, it's true. No, you hear more and more. I mean, this double standard, and it's against the U.S. And I saw it also in the United States, especially when at Kamala Harris rally in Atlanta, there were maybe 200-300 people outside demonstrating for Palestine, for support for Palestine, and inside Kamala Harris is not even mentioning, and people were frustrated, saying, "Where is she standing? Is she not?" They continue to give weapons and pay money, political support, and weapons to Israel, but what about Palestinians? There's an enormous frustration that it's not clear, whose side are you on, and how come you support Israel, but what about you look at Ukraine and you are staunchly against Putin, but Israel support.
I mean, there's never going to be a proper answer to this that will make any sense to anybody who's had anything to do with humanitarian work or international law. I would say that this particular conflict has done more to undermine the US place in the world, but at the same time undermine the multilateral system than anything that we've seen in the last few decades. I see it a terrible fracturing, and people won't forget. They won't forget this.
And it may change the election in the United States. I think what Gunilla saw, what Tammam mentions, I think a lot of people in the United States will not vote for Kamala Harris simply because she won't come out and say that I will do this or I will no longer continue to support Israel, and which will mean in the end that probably Trump will win if that happens. Where we don't even know. We can't imagine what he'll do. We know as far as multilateralism what he'll do. As far as the Israel situation, we're not sure. But I do think that there are two words that are key here. One is the notion of polarization, not only in the United States, but internationally. We see it in Geneva, we see it everywhere. And the second is the word transactional. Everything seems to be transactional. What's in this for me? Instead of someone coming along and saying, for the common good. And those kinds of moral, ethical questions have totally disappeared from the narrative that's going on today.
I also think that, just to add, I think it is so much, well, you have the Gaza conflict, of course, in Israel, but I think what happened in Ukraine and the invasion by Russia in Ukraine has destroyed so much, so deeply. That has completely closed the door between the West and Russia. Russia is turning east. And this we're going to have to live with for generations, I think. That conflict, what's going on in Ukraine today, has much deeper repercussions than we can imagine, I think.
Also, let's remember, Russia invaded Syria in 2015.
Exact.
And no one did anything. And, and bombed the hell out of it and displaced hundreds of thousands of people and actually sustained the regime in Syria and continues to do so. I mean, I'm not going to sulk about how that affected my country, but I'm going to say also politics and so even bad politics requires smart people. And the inability to see the obvious over the past couple of decades in most political circles is staggering. The fact that the US didn't see the, invading multiple countries, 2 decades of drone bombing and supplying weapons to Israel and others is going to backfire one day. Letting Putin, give him Syria, he'll be fine. No, he wasn't fine. And he won't ever be. All that, I mean, it wasn't impossible to predict or deal with, but everybody was throwing stuff down the road. And we're now down the road. Chicken, is it that how you say it? Chicken come back home to
To
roost?
roost.
They're roosting now.
Well, on that note, we're actually just about at the end. I've got one really cliched basic question for each of you, because we did start talking about the consequences on international Geneva for the US presidential elections. So, basic question, does it even matter who's in the White House in January 25? I'm going to come to you first, Gunilla, from maybe the Europe point of view.
I really do think so, because it's a matter of support, political, financial, moral support to international questions, to international Geneva. I think Europe is there, yes, but Europe will not be able, I think, to match the United States. We have a lot of problems in Europe right now, and we have the war in Ukraine to deal with. So there is a need for the United States. It matters who is there. The world needs someone who cares about the world and about multilateralism and global support. And I don't think that's Trump. I think that's more likely Kamala Harris.
What do you think, Tammam? I mean, it ain't a perfect world, as we say. Harris would be preferable to Trump.
I mean, I can't, I stopped anticipating stuff. It's just too difficult. I mean, who knows? Trump was following the wave of his supporters or his, indoctrinators. Now he doesn't really, maybe he doesn't care enough. He has no next elections. Maybe he will change his mind. He's changed his mind on abortion the past week since,
Several
so
times, I think.
Harris. Paris has a next election to think about, and I fear. I'm not saying it's not preferable. I fear the. We've been bitten from this hole before twice. I obsessed about Obama winning the elections in 2008, and then he ended up bombing the hell out of civilians for 8 years. I wanted Biden to win, and he's now, in a plausible genocide. He's the godfather of it. Do we want to sit here and wait until we're disillusioned yet again? I don't know. I don't know what's preferable, and I fear that we won't know until we know. And until then, Geneva is one of the singular places. And I don't think even New York as a center of a UN is capable of that. It's way too political. One of the few places where you can intersect people who work on multiple issues related to international politics, not from the political angle, from the IT, from the communication, from the health, from the displacement, and so on. There's a conversation that is possible here in Geneva that is not possible almost anywhere else. And that might be a form of multilateralism that needs to be supported and encouraged as well.
That is a delightfully optimistic point to make, Tammam. So I'm glad you made it in what was largely a relatively gloomy program. But yes, let's tip a hat to Geneva and indeed the types of conversations which happen here, which are always aiming for the best, but often incredibly practical and realistic as well. Now, Danny, I'm going to give, as our US citizen, the last word to you. Does it matter to Geneva who's in the White House?
There are over 30 cities in the United States called Geneva because the Geneva Bible was on the Mayflower. I don't think in the United States today, Geneva, Switzerland is high on the agenda in this election. But I'll try and be optimistic with Taman. There are things going on here that traditional Democrats and Republicans understand the importance of, one can only hope that there will be some reasonables returning to the United States after this election.
Okay, well, a bit of, like I said, some optimism to end on. That's it for this edition of Inside Geneva. My thanks to Daniel Warner, Gunilla von Hall, and Tammam Aloudat for your insights. Brutally realistic, all of you, but I think we all need that. And I'll just maybe stay with Tammam for my final words. It's maybe better in the climate we live in not to try to anticipate too much. Thank you all for listening.
A reminder, you've been listening to Inside Geneva, a Swissinfo production. You can email us on insidegeneva@swissinfo.ch and subscribe to us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Check out our previous episodes, how the International Red Cross unites prisoners of war with their families, or why survivors of human rights violations turn to the UN in Geneva for justice. I'm Imogen Folks. Thanks again for listening.
Get ready to explore the crossroads of innovation and entrepreneurship. Listen to our latest series of the Swiss Connection podcast, where we dive into the fascinating parallels between Switzerland and Silicon Valley. Switzerland and Silicon Valley are hubs of cutting-edge research and groundbreaking innovation. But what makes Silicon Valley the pinnacle of entrepreneurial culture and investment? Join our journalists Marc-André Miseret and Sarah Ibrahim as they venture into the heart of Silicon Valley. They sit down with Swiss-born entrepreneurs to uncover what Switzerland can learn from the world's tech capital. Get inspired by real stories from leading innovators in technology. Listen and subscribe to the Swiss Connection's latest series now, available wherever you get your podcasts.